The sound of his laughter was a jagged blade cutting through my spirit as I stood trembling in the hallway. I watched through the cracked door while he leaned into her, because he thought I was too broken to notice. My chest felt like it was collapsing as the realization hit me that my 3-year investment was nothing but a joke to him. I wanted to scream because the betrayal was so casual, and yet I stayed frozen as the house went silent. The man I loved was a stranger, and therefore the air in my lungs felt like cold lead as I turned away. Everything I knew was a lie, and because he smirked, I knew the real nightmare was only just beginning. Trust is like a house built on sand, where you don't realize the foundation is washing away until the roof starts to collapse on your head while you sleep. I am 22 years old, but looking back at that summer makes me feel like I have lived 100 lifetimes in the span of a single week. I was scrolling through a thread on Reddit where people were sharing their deepest betrayals, and because my own story was burning a hole in my chest, I knew I had to finally speak the truth about what happened at that beach house. We had been together for 3 years, and therefore I thought Jason was the person I would grow old with, but he was already planning a different future that didn't involve my heart staying intact. I spent months saving every dollar for my shifts at the warehouse because I wanted to give him a luxury vacation that he would never forget, and as we pulled up to that secluded rental, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. I didn't question why he insisted on inviting Mark and Chloe because I wanted him to be happy, but as soon as we stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted into something predatory and cold. Jason was acting with a frantic energy while he pushed drinks toward me, and because I loved him, I didn't realize he was trying to dim my light so he could dance in the dark with someone else. I was funding my own execution. I remember the way the sun hit the water that first afternoon, but even then, there was a shadow over the deck because Jason wouldn't meet my eyes for more than a second. He kept whispering to Chloe while Mark sat back and watched me with a look of twisted pity that I was too naive to understand at the time. I spent the evening grilling steaks and laughing because I thought we were all friends, yet every time I turned my back, the whispers grew louder and the air grew thinner. Because I was so focused on being the perfect partner, I missed the way their hands brushed under the table, and therefore, I was the only person in that house who didn't know the rules of the game we were playing. By the time the moon rose over the ocean, the trap was already set, and as Jason handed me a glass of wine that smelled slightly bitter, I realized that my role in this story was just to be the provider while he sought his thrills elsewhere. I drank it because I trusted him, and therefore I became the architect of my own heartbreak while the three of them waited for the chemicals to pull me under. The morning sun felt like a spotlight on a crime scene because I woke up with a head that felt like it was filled with broken glass while Jason was already humming a tune in the kitchen. I looked at the glass on the nightstand and realized it was nearly full because I had spilled most of it into the rug while my vision was blurring the night before, and therefore I was far more conscious than he wanted me to be. I watched him through the door as he checked his phone and smiled a secret, jagged smile that wasn't meant for me because he thought I was still lost in a chemically induced sleep. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine as I reached for my own phone and saw a notification for a shared photo album that Chloe had accidentally left open to everyone on the house Wi-Fi. My thumb hovered over the screen while my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird because I knew that opening that folder would change the trajectory of my life forever. I clicked it and saw the first image, which was a candid shot of me passed out on the sofa while Jason stood in the background with his arms wrapped around Chloe's neck. My soul left my body. Because I saw the timestamp was from only an hour after I had supposedly gone to bed, I realized that the betrayal hadn't been a moment of weakness, but a calculated performance that they had been rehearsing all evening. I scrolled further while my hands began to shake because there were photos of them laughing in the kitchen while I was feet away, and therefore the house I had paid for had become a playground for my own humiliation. I saw a photo of a staged scene where they had moved my limp hand to hold a bottle of liquor to make it look like I had overindulged on my own, and as I looked at Jason's face in that picture, I didn't recognize the man I had spent 3 years protecting. He looked exhilarated by the deception while I looked like a prop in his twisted movie, and because I could hear his footsteps approaching the bedroom, I had to lock my phone and close my eyes to pretend the world wasn't burning down around me. He entered the room with a tray of breakfast and a voice as sweet as honey while he asked how I was feeling, but I could smell the scent of Chloe's perfume lingering on his skin as he leaned down to kiss my forehead. I had to bite my tongue until it bled because I wanted to scream the truth at him, yet I knew that if I spoke now, I would lose the only advantage I had left in this house of mirrors. I thanked him for the food while watching his eyes for a flicker of guilt, but there was nothing there except a shallow, shimmering vanity, because he truly believed he was clever enough to destroy me without me ever feeling the blow. Therefore, I sat there eating toast that tasted like ash while I planned my next move, because for the first time in our relationship, I was the one holding a secret that could burn everything to the ground. The rest of that afternoon was a masterclass in psychological torture because I had to sit on the sun-drenched deck and watch the three of them interact while the knowledge of their betrayal sat like a lead weight in my stomach. I became a silent observer in my own life, and therefore I noticed every lingering touch and every coded word that Jason exchanged with Chloe as if they were speaking a language I was never supposed to learn. I sat there with a book in my hand, pretending to read while my eyes were actually fixed on the reflection in the glass door because I wanted to see what they did when they thought I wasn't looking. I watched as Mark leaned over to whisper something in Jason's ear while pointing at me, and then they all broke into a quiet, cruel laughter that made the blood in my veins turn to ice water. Because I stayed quiet, they began to grow bold, and I watched as Jason reached out to brush a strand of hair from Chloe's face right in front of me while he asked me if I wanted another drink with a smirk that was dripping with condescending pity. I was a ghost at my own funeral. I realized then that they didn't just want to betray me, they wanted to do it while I was watching because the risk was the only thing that made it feel real to them, and therefore I decided to give them all the rope they needed to hang themselves. I watched Jason's face as he lied to me about his plans for the evening, claiming he had a headache and needed to rest early, while he was actually coordinating a time to meet them in the guest suite because he thought I was too broken and dim-witted to see the cracks in his story. The pain was a physical throb in my temples, but I kept my voice steady and my expression blank because I knew that any flicker of emotion would give the game away before I was ready to flip the table. I spent the evening walking along the shoreline alone while they stayed back at the house, and as I looked at the dark water, I realized that the man I loved had never actually existed because the person back in that house was a stranger who thrived on the destruction of my trust. I returned to the house and retreated to our bedroom, lying perfectly still in the darkness while I listened to the muffled sounds of the hallway because I knew the exact moment the door to the other room would open. I heard his footsteps, light and hurried as he slipped away from my side, and therefore I spent the night staring at the ceiling while my heart shattered into a million pieces with every creak of the floorboards from the room next door. Because I chose silence over a scene, I was able to gather the strength I needed for the confrontation, and as the moon moved across the sky, I felt the last lingering threads of my love for him snap one by one until there was nothing left but a cold, hard resolve to show him exactly who he had been playing with. The final morning arrived with a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press against my chest because I knew the clock was ticking down to the moment I would finally have to look him in the eye and let her know I saw everything. I watched him walk into the kitchen with a glowing smile, as if he hadn't just spent the night in another woman's arms while I lay feet away in the dark, and therefore the breakfast he prepared felt like a bowl of poison that I was being forced to swallow for the sake of the plan. Because I remained quiet, the air in the house became thick with an unspoken tension that only I could feel while the three of them acted like they were on the cover of a travel magazine, laughing about the great memories we were making together. I sat at the table and watched Jason talk about his future plans while Chloe nodded with an adoring gaze that used to be reserved for me, and as I gripped my coffee mug until my knuckles turned white, I realized that the disrespect wasn't just in the act itself, but in the way they expected me to thank them for the privilege of being there. The air was running out. I felt like I was vibrating with a hidden frequency, because every time he touched my shoulder or asked me to pass the salt, I had to suppress the urge to scream until my throat was raw, and therefore I spent the afternoon packing my bags with a methodical, cold precision that he mistook for travel anxiety. He came into the room and tried to wrap his arms around my waist while whispering about how much he loved our time together, but because I could still see the faint mark on his neck that wasn't there 2 days ago, I had to physically pull away and pretend I was looking for my keys to avoid his touch. I saw a flash of irritation in his eyes because he wasn't used to me being distant, and as he walked out of the room to join the others for one last drink on the deck, I knew that the pressure cooker was about to explode because I couldn't play the role of the oblivious girlfriend for a single second longer. I stood in the middle of that room and took one long, deep breath while the sound of their laughter drifted in from the balcony, realizing that the next time I spoke, I would be burning every bridge I had built over the last 3 years because some betrayals are too deep to ever be forgiven. The sun was setting behind the jagged cliffs as we all gathered on the deck for our final toast, and because they all looked so smug in their shared victory over my ignorance, I decided that the time for silence had finally reached its expiration date. I pulled out my phone and placed it in the center of the table while the ice in my glass rattled against the sides, and as Jason reached out to take a sip of his wine with a smile that was as fake as his loyalty, I hit play on the shared album and watched the color drain from his face in an instant. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the breath out of my lungs while Chloe and Mark stared at the screen where their own betrayal was staring back at them in high definition, and therefore the carefully constructed mask that Jason had worn for 3 years shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right before my eyes. The trap was finished. I didn't shout or scream because the quiet truth was more devastating than any noise I could make, and as I looked at Jason while he tried to stammer out a lie that his own eyes couldn't support, I felt the power shift so violently that the very air in the house seemed to grow cold and thin. He didn't cry or apologize because once he realized he couldn't manipulate the facts, he chose to lean into his malice, and therefore he let out a sharp, mocking laugh that felt like a slap across my face while he told me I was pathetic for even caring about what he did behind my back. I watched Mark look at his feet like a coward while Chloe sipped her drink as if she were watching a movie, and because I realized that these people were nothing more than empty vessels of cruelty, I stood up and picked at my car keys with a hand that was finally, remarkably steady. I told him that he could find his own way home, because the lease on the house was in my name, and I had already called the management to have them removed by morning, and as I walked toward the door, I felt the crushing weight of the last 3 years lift off my shoulders, because I was no longer the victim of a story I hadn't agreed to write. The drive home was a blur of highway lights and empty miles because for the first time in my adult life, I was breathing air that wasn't contaminated by his lies, while the quiet hum of the engine felt like a companion in my new, cold freedom. I didn't look at my phone as the notifications from him started to flood in, because I knew the cycle of begging and blaming was just another attempt to regain the control he had lost on that deck, and therefore I blocked his number before I even crossed the state line. I walked into our shared apartment and began the clinical process of removing every trace of his existence because I refused to live in a museum dedicated to a man who had spent our final days laughing at my pain. And as the sunrise hit the empty walls, I realized that I wasn't just losing a boyfriend, but gaining a version of myself that would never be played for a fool again. I am finally whole. I spent the next few months rebuilding my life from the ground up because the betrayal had stripped away my naivety while leaving behind a hard, unbreakable core of self-respect that no amount of mockery could ever touch. I learned that trust is not a weakness, but a luxury that must be earned every single day, and therefore I look at my scars not with shame, but with the pride of a woman who survived a war she didn't know she was fighting until the final shot was fired. I don't wonder what he is doing or who he is with, because he is no longer a character in my reality, and as I sit here sharing this with you, I want you to remember that the loudest laughter usually comes from the person who is about to lose everything they ever pretended to value. He didn't just break my heart. He laughed because he realized he had successfully used 3 years of my life to pay for a vacation he shared with everyone but me. Betrayal is never an accident. It is a series of choices made in the dark, and therefore your only responsibility is to turn on the light and walk away the moment you see the truth. Have you ever looked at someone you loved and realized you were looking at a complete stranger? How did you find the strength to walk away when the memories tried to pull you back? I'm okay now. In fact, I've never been better. Take care of yourselves.